Please give it up for Ryan Duffin.
Thank you. All right. Hi, I'm Ryan Duffin. I've been animating in video games for 18 years. Before I ramble at you for the worst part of your next hour, I want to do something we normally do at the end, at the beginning. I'm going to talk a lot about not knowing what you wanted to hear about, but I've flown all the way out here for you. So, I need this. I want to make sure I answer any questions you might have for me, regardless of your ability to get on a microphone in a crowded room or to intercept me after the event, whether it's about animation, AAA game dev, stuff I've worked on, or places I've worked, whatever. So if you use hashtag Konsoll 2019 Ask Ryan, I'm trying to do a little experiment here. We'll see if it works. You can ask me whatever you want, and I will try my best to answer you as long as the question is respectful to your fellow audience members, and the answer won't get me in trouble. I know it's presumptuous of me to lead with that, but I want you to be able to ask whatever, whenever you think of it. Now I should probably explain a little bit more about who I am and why you might want to ask me anything. I've been making games for a living since 2001. I worked at Treyarch back when they still made games that weren't Call of Duty. I worked in Amsterdam on Guerrilla Games on Killzone 2. I worked in Finland on Alan Wake at Remedy. DICE Stockholm Battlefield 3, Los Angeles for Battlefield 4, 1, and 5. I almost got to say Battlefield 1 through 5, but they messed that up. A short stint on the end of Anthem and some other stuff in between, all up there. So, I'm currently the animation director at The Initiative as of about 4 months. The Initiative is basically a startup within Microsoft, and I can't talk about anything that we're doing for a while, so I hope you weren't expecting that. But I can say that I'm really excited about the studio, the project, and the people that I get to work with. We've built a pretty amazing team so far. Earlier drafts of this talk had a whole section about how I struggled to find a topic. When I agreed to do this talk, I had a seed of an idea, speed and scale, which I think is something that a lot of people in game dev misunderstand. And I will get into that, but it's not something I can actually spend an hour on. Despite shipping 2 big games in the last 12 months, not only did I not have a burning topic to discuss from either of them, but I don't even work for the place that made them anymore. The thing I kept getting stuck on was, what do people actually want to hear me talk about? This was very stressful, actually, and people back home are going to be happy they don't have to hear me worry about this when I get back. I started to think about everything I could talk about and writing one big talk that strung them all together, a smorgasbord of small topics, if you will. In that gut-churning, sleepless panic to give you something worth chewing on, I wrote a talk that is nearly 200 slides on 3 or 4 different topics. It's probably 2, if not 3 full hours of 1-hour talks. So I'm going to skip the whole backstory I had prepared to make room for the meat. The year is 2019. Everyone seems to know everything about how anything works. You can tweet questions directly at the heads of your favorite studio or any of their employees about how game dev works and probably get an answer. So why then is there so much bullshit? Why, when experts have never been more accessible, is there so much misinformation? Everyone you need access to can tell you about their professional experiences or practices. The public's perception of how game dev works used to be this big question mark, but these days it's an exclamation point, but it's at the end of the wrong sentence. We have tons of amateurs on YouTube who have never made a game in their life telling people how it works with some badge of authority that they made for themselves and algorithms that send hapless gamers to them. Expertise lost out to a popularity contest. Anyone can find out anything, but they don't want to because they think they already know how it works, and it's making everything worse. It's a great time to be running a conference or attending one because the internet is just this wild west of misinformation. Al Snow, a professional wrestler, articulates this about professional wrestling in a great interview on YouTube, but he could really just as easily be talking about gaming and gamers. I'm going to play just a little brief part of this.
Opinion is the lowest form of human knowledge. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You can form an opinion with little or no actual information. And then you can go around and spout it off as if it's a real fact, when it's nothing more than theory, conjecture, and assumption. Real knowledge is not information. It takes a matter of information and experience together that make real knowledge. So you have a bunch of people, fans, that now have access and are privy to information, but have no actual experience. And since they have the information, they think they now have knowledge and an understanding of a business that they've never been in and have never had any experience.
I know that's about professional wrestling, but this was making its rounds on Twitter, and I wanted to share it because it's just as applicable. I actually don't know anything about professional wrestling, but that really struck a chord. There's more to this interview, and it's worth watching, but that was a key thing. Basically, the access to all this information, which is nothing more than opinion, makes fandoms resentful because they think they know how it's supposed to work, and then they don't see it work that way. It's obviously not just games suffering from amateur experts. The whole earth seems to be hemorrhaging with bad ideas about things and how they work. Now, this is Game Dev Conference and not a TED Talk, but maybe I can help. Where maybe I can help is to talk about the things that I most frequently see people misunderstand about game dev and about especially my trade of animation. So I want to repeat this now with a little better context. I'm an 18-year veteran of AAA game dev animation. Ask me anything. I will also be taking questions on the mic. So from my smorgasbord of topics, there are 3 that I settled on. I'm going to go real deep on 2, and 1 mostly got sacrificed to the editing gods, but it's in the program, so it's not cut out completely. Don't worry, that was the depressing one. So credit where credit is due. As you're going to see, a lot of this talk is going to be other people's knowledge and work that I've collated and regurgitated into something new and hopefully easy to swallow. This is my favorite GIF. I was just waiting for the throw up, it doesn't come. Also credits to my friend in the amazing game dev animation community who repeatedly kept me going when I was lost on this talk, especially your own Azak Helgeson. There's stuff in here I already knew, but friends on Twitter or from GDC have said it better than I could. I will do my best to credit as I struggled to find a topic to present. I became aware that some of my value giving a talk here is to separate some of the bad information from the good, rather than to just present more new information. So first we'll get into animation misunderstandings. I'm going to start with the things that I think that you as a non-animator, exception to animators in the room, be you students or developers, can learn from an animator that might help you be a better developer. Remember, animation has been around a lot longer than a lot of game dev disciplines, and I think that's something that people forget sometimes. Game dev, math, and art have been around since the beginning of civilization, but unlike most of those high-level fields, you could pluck an animator from 90 years ago and put them into game production, and maybe get something pretty worth shipping. That's a lot more time to refine a craft and establish best practices that a lot of game devs jobs have had, and so maybe there's some collective wisdom to be gained there. The first misunderstanding I want to address is about scale and speed. This was going to be the entire topic, but it needed to be relegated to a smaller portion of the talk because this subject is, at its core, so intertwined in physics that if I talk about it for an hour, I'm definitely going to say something that isn't correct. So I'm going to skate around most of the actual physics of the topic and stick with the bits around animation and, more importantly, why you as a non-animator should care. So let's start with a pendulum, but not the math part. In the following YouTube pendulum example, which I brazenly ripped from K-Class Science channel on YouTube, please subscribe. The pendulum is about 45 to 50 centimeters long, or as we would measure in the United States, 1.8 of George Washington's shoes. Remember, no math. So in this video, we see the correct length of the pendulum and the correct speed. I apologize for the imperfect sync of the 3D pendulum, but that you see the overall timing is correct and accurate, and that's what's most important here. Remember, this is a 50 centimeter long pendulum, roughly. But if we put it on the end of a 100 centimeter long broadsword, which would make the bob of this pendulum now roughly tennis ball size, it's not quite right. We've doubled the length of the pendulum, but we haven't adjusted the playback speed. Now, if we also double the playback time by halving the speed of the animation, now we have something more like a tennis ball swinging from the end of a sword. I unfortunately do not have the facilities to make videos of actual different length pendulums of comparative lengths, but I imagine you've all been through something similar like this in secondary school from real professional educators. I'm not qualified to teach you physics, and that's not what you're here to learn. I just want to remind you that this is a thing. Frequency of a pendulum is dependent on the length of the pendulum. So what? Well, as you may know, joints of a character get animated either through inverse kinematics by an end effector, which would be, inverse kinematics, you drive it by the end, or forward kinematics, where one rotation at a time. Does that look familiar? In its dumbest form, the skeletons you export from Maya and import into a game engine are just a bunch of forward kinematic chains, a bunch of pendulums, with other forces applied, of course. But why does that matter? Well, we know that the length of a pendulum dictates the frequency of the pendulum swing, which means the frequency of the pendulum suggests the length of the pendulum. In other words, the speed in which we see things move suggests the scale of the things that are moving. Both of these are 300% scale. The one on the left wouldn't be so weird for, say, an eagle or a falcon, or a big bird of prey. The one on the right, maybe a big dog or a horse. So what's my angle here? That's easy. How many of you have ever time-scaled an animation to conform it to parameters it wasn't animated with? A movement speed that wasn't intended, that wasn't snappy enough. Do you see the connection here? When animators tell you not to scale their animations, I think sometimes that gets heard in the same way as artists not wanting you to down-res their textures or compress their assets. But the problem is not that you've made it look worse, but that you've actually made it look, by the laws of physics and human perception, wrong, in that the motion becomes appropriate to something smaller or larger in scale. I get it. The quality of motion is not the paramount thing in shipping a video game, but you got to understand what you're deciding to break before you decide to break it. And so often we come up with standards like, it's okay to scale it by 15 to 20%. So let's look at that with some examples that you might be familiar with. If you haven't seen this movie, bless your heart. This is the first part of the Matrix Dojo fight with 120% playback rate. Look at the jump here. The next one has a few more elements of scale involved, and I've only adjusted it to play at 15% faster, which is a pretty common fault tolerance for animation scaling. It's not super obvious. 15% of anything isn't going to be super obvious unless it's maybe 15% on fire. You see it in the way the Jeep hooks up impossibly well in the mud, or the T-Rex seems weightless. You see it most obviously in the frantic humans who are now turning their heads at superhuman speeds. The next two clips don't have sound. Everything's playing fine. All right, so you get it? Also, did you notice the one shot of Laura Dern looking incredibly chill while the T-Rex is chasing them? It's my favorite part. Here's one of the iconic scenes from Inception, which is especially interesting because it's so reliant on gravity. Look at how some of the camera cuts don't even read anymore. This one's also 15%. I don't remember if I mentioned. Makes kind of a big difference. Anyway, you get it. Hopefully that helps you understand what even a small time adjustment looks like in practice. And hopefully you'll remember this chunk of the talk the next time you see a need to timescale something. I get it. Sometimes this has to happen. But I just hope you have a little more appreciation to the damage that's being done every time that you do. Timing in motion is just one principle of animation that it behooves non-animators to know. But there are 12 principles of animation in total. Maybe you've heard of them. Maybe you just heard of them in the last talk. I don't know. But before you dismiss this as some crap that only animators need to know, remember, animation is not just character animation. It's the illusion of life. It's moving things with character. Every time you move something on screen, whether it's through code, blueprints, gamepad, or the UI, you're animating it. So maybe it doesn't hurt to know this. There are cheat sheets all over the internet for this, and since I've got a captive audience here, I'm just going to show you one from YouTube. This is from animator Sento Lodigiani. Apologies if I mispronounced the name. It's all 12 principles demonstrated in about 2.5 minutes.
The following has been paraphrased from The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Squash and stretch. This action gives the illusion of weight and volume to a character as it moves. Anticipation. Prepares the audience for a major action the character is about to perform. Each major action is preceded with specific moves that anticipate for the audience what is about to happen. Staging. It's the presentation of an idea so that it is clear. Straight ahead and pose to pose. Pose to pose is charted with key drawings done at intervals throughout the scene. Straight ahead animation starts at the first drawing and works drawing to the end of a scene. Follow through and overlapping. When the main body of the character stops, all other parts continue to catch up to the main mass. Nothing stops all at once. Slow in and slow out. As the action starts, we have more drawings near the starting pose, 1 or 2 in the middle, and more drawings near the next pose. Fewer drawings make the action faster, and more drawings make the action slower. Arcs. All actions, with few exceptions, follow an arc or slightly circular path. Arcs give animation a more natural action and better flow. Secondary action. It's an additional action in the scene used as a supplement of the main one in order to reinforce it and add more dimension. Timing. More drawings between poses slow and smooth the action. Fewer drawings make the action faster and crisper. Timing maintains the appearance of an object abiding by the laws of physics. Exaggeration. Remain true to reality, just presenting it in a wild or more extreme form. Solid drawings. It means taking into account forms in three-dimensional space, giving them volume and weight. Appeal. It's a quality of charm, able to please the viewer's eyes. It's the charisma of the action.
I know you didn't come here to sit and watch YouTube videos, but that right there is basically how to animate in 2.5 minutes. Again, you don't have to be an animator to get value from understanding this. This is a cheat sheet from Jorge Rolando Canedo Estrada that shows these principles applied to motion design. Notice that neither of these feature any characters. These guys are just animating with basic primitives, like a player's collision capsule maybe. Animation is not just character animation. The third thing I wanted to talk about is workflows and pre-production, but Andy Smits was here this morning talking about building new and very successful IP, and my talk was too long anyway. So I'll focus on maybe where my perspective could be unique. In pre-production, so who knows if Abraham Lincoln actually said this, but somebody smart did. This is a pre-production mentality. Whether you're cutting down a tree or making a video game, working smarter, not harder makes sense. If you were here in 2017, this probably sounds familiar. I'm going to go into 2 things about pre-production, and the first is reference, or knowing your subject matter. Recently, some colleagues and I were debating if a game designer could make a fun racing game without knowing anything about racing. There were some arguments that yes, they could. My argument was that they could potentially make a fun game, but it probably wouldn't be a racing game that captures what is fun about racing or why people are into it. So the following is a chunk of strong opinions, not objective facts. See, I spent over 7 years of my working life with a primary focus of making satisfying first-person weapon animations for multiplayer shooters, and if there's one thing I learned from that, is that there's a lot of people out there who know a lot more about guns than me. I learned a ton over those years about the subject matter, both from my research and from the corrections to my mistakes. The whole association of me being a gun animator is something I'm happy to leave in my past, but I'll always be grateful for the valuable perspective on reference and research that work gave me. That talk, which I think is on the GDC Vault for free, had actually been inspired by my research into archery, to add a bow into Battlefield 4. I knew I could make a bow work in our animation system just based on how bows work, but at the time I didn't know enough about archery to make it convincing. So I took some time to learn from the pros to make sure I'd do them proud. I started thinking about every racing game I'd played where changing a sway bar would affect your braking power or some other gamey nonsense that broke the illusion for me. I thought about sports fans and how little I actually know about sports. My being a professional game developer doesn't automatically make me a subject matter expert. Hell, I started my career in 2001 on a sports game for a sport I've never done in my life. I never went more than waist deep in the ocean until 5 years after this game came out. So I guess I've kind of been in over my head on research and reference from the beginning of my career. Archery is a pretty good example of this, actually. Nearly 20 million Americans participated in archery events in 2012. That's a little over 6% of the US population. But when Katniss, Merida, and Hawkeye hit the big screens, we saw the proficiency spectrum range from mastery to absurdity. And 6% isn't a huge portion of the population, but those 6% might write articles or be consulted in hit pieces, and suddenly everyone knows that you didn't do your homework. With the kind of critical analysis that games get these days, getting these details right or wrong can actually make a difference. Maybe no one's going to notice. Lots of people won't. Most people won't. But think of the things that you know a lot about. If you play music and you see somebody on TV playing your instrument, you probably can't help but notice when it's totally fake. If you're a car person, this trope might make you snicker. Sports fans, there's enough of them that we can probably assume that there's some empirical knowledge on the dev teams that make them. But if I worked on another sports game, I'd have to have a whole lot of education in front of me before I'd be a valuable contributor. And this is not a call out, lots of devs get this right. I visited Turn 10 a couple of months ago and got into a conversation about transmissions with the second guy that I met. Some of the key developers on UFC are pretty hardcore into the sport. This is my former colleague Jeff Harrower, about to choke out my friend Tim Borelli on stage at GDC 16. The animation boot camp's always exciting. Jeff is a lead programmer on UFC and is more than qualified to be making games about it. EA's NHL games are made in Canada by Canadians. What other qualification do you need? But it's just a game, Ryan. Is anyone in this room that dispassionate about every aspect of video games as a medium or an art form? Or is this just something people say dismissively when they're less passionate about a particular aspect of a game than the person that they're debating it with? This to me is actually an offensive phrase in game development. I actually hate it when people say this, especially professional game developers. We're in the business of building compelling experiences, and what makes an experience compelling is a little different to everyone. Anyone who's done market research into player motivations, which is a fascinating subject on its own, by the way, knows that people play games for a lot of different reasons. You might not see or care about a weakness in what you're building, but unless you cover your bases, somebody might. Realism isn't fun. Well, you got me there, and I'll pile onto that one. Sometimes realism isn't even really believable. We've all seen things in real life that actually happened that are quite opposed to what we'd consider good animation, or even believe they're real before we see it with our own eyes. And there's plenty more things that look great but aren't particularly fun or responsive. The illusion of life, as we say in animation, is not the replication of life. We are looking for believability, not realism. But part of creating that believability is knowing the rules before you decide if you should break them. Breaking the rules is very often the right thing to do. I can't emphasize that enough. But being oblivious to their existence is how you pull some members of your audience right out of the experience. Part of this for animators is shooting reference, or at least to get up and act things out, and that's solid advice. That's a pretty key part of any animation education. But your animation is only as good as your reference, right? And I'm not using these GIFs to make fun of these guys. This is what it would look like if I tried any of those moves as well. Obviously, it's not feasible to learn your subject matter inside and out before you're allowed to work on it. Directors, writers, and actors do it all the time, except maybe Christian Bale. I think he actually does all that. You don't have to be an expert. But in my experience, you can learn the most important chunks about any topic or subculture with a sampler plate, at least to learn enough about what parts you should dig deeper on. This is something I talk about a lot, and I'm probably overemphasizing it. I'm definitely repeating some of the talk that I've given before. Hopefully that's enough for the point to stick. And if you disagree, that's fine. Find me later. I love debating this stuff. Last bit on pre-production, actually the last bit on animation. Research and reference are a big part of this, especially for animators, but pre-production is something I don't think gets enough attention in game development. Maybe pre-production is on the schedule, but it usually also ends because of the schedule, not because we're ready to move on. Now, I think pre-production and game dev can get misinterpreted in all kinds of ways. On one end of the spectrum, there's the idea that a 400-page design Bible, which is anyone who's shipped a game before it can tell you that might as well be written on toilet paper. On the other end, and I've seen it happen at most big companies who should know better, we just dive right into making a game with a big team and not much of a clear direction or vision. We call it finding the fun or iterating on an idea, and those are real things that we should be doing in pre-production. But those phases can also end up being an excuse for a lack of clarity and vision. I often say pre-production is my religion, and one of the tenets of that religion is the elevator pitch. An elevator pitch, if you don't know, is the hypothetical 30 to 60-second conversation you have after cornering a producer, investor, or executive into funding your project. I guess there's probably some elevator pitches happening here this week. Elevator pitch may be too salesy of a term. In writing, you would have a log line and a synopsis. I've heard takedowns of the elevator pitch concept before, but mostly they're around how you probably shouldn't corner people in elevators. But the intention's good. You should be able to explain your high-level concept a high-level game idea quickly and clearly in a way that generates interest and excitement to your audience, but most importantly to your team. I don't want to tell you the right way or the wrong way to do a thing, but I can tell you from experience that we are habitual in this industry about starting to work on things that we haven't really thought about enough. If you can't do that, if you can't explain your idea, maybe you need to work on your pitching skills, but it also might mean that the idea isn't as well formed as you think it is. Now, if you've made games before and you're rolling your eyes at this, fair enough. The game you ship will probably never be the same game that you started with in your head. Games evolve through time and through teams. And if you think that you're the auteur who is the exception to this rule, make a game by yourself and test that theory before you drag anyone else into your madness, please. This is one of those quotes that's very likely misattributed. I'm sure generals knew this to be true long before the 19th century. But having an idea of where you're going, where you think you're going, is better than not, even if you're not going to get there. The very Amerocentric example of this that I like to give is you don't get in your car and just start driving. You pick a destination and then you start driving. And maybe you find something more interesting along the way. Maybe you get closer to your destination. You find it's not as great as you thought, so you go somewhere else. The plan will change, but that's not a good excuse to not start with one. Animation, feature animation especially, has been doing the same thing for a long time, working out the moves on paper before spending the time to actually animate them. Not a lot of finished animation used to be cut from feature films because anything that didn't work would get cut long before it hit final quality. But lots of people in games have never worked with a storyboard artist or other these kind of concepts. Even though most game cinematics are mini movies, it's not uncommon to hear about not starting with 3D layout or even animatics. I've even heard of creative directors who need to see the finished product before they think they can evaluate it. Do you know how expensive that is? You can gray box gameplay animation too. Like this great example from the first Bayonetta. They built a combat system out of a bunch of one-frame animations that sold the look and feel of Bayonetta. I don't know if we have any audio talks, but if so, that's a great example of how even that really basic previs audio makes a difference. Speaking of previs animation, more and more studios are getting their own in-house motion capture facilities or inertial suits like the XNs or various optical camera systems. The amount of animation you can generate with access to your own suit or stage is pretty staggering. You can populate a game with a whole lot of workable but non-final assets quickly this way. So this leads to my second misconception about mocap. A slight aside, when I was afraid of not having enough good content for you, I basically wrote a whole half-hour talk on how mocap works and how to do it. But in the interest of time, I have butchered that down from a whole how-to to just kicking out the biggest misunderstandings around it. I know there's a lot of students and indies here, so you might be thinking, what am I talking about mocap for at all? That's some crazy expensive stuff that big corporate studios do. That's the first misconception I want to dispel. People have had some success with mocapping from an Xbox Kinect camera or two, and there's new competitors into the space every year. Rococo's suit starts at $2,500 US. Perception Neuron is under $2,000 US. I can't testify to the quality of these budget mocap solutions, but we're making big advances fast, and mocap is one area that's quickly becoming democratized. If you have a real budget, there are options from XNs for inertial suits that a lot of studios are having success with for previs or even final quality work. And of course, if you have the room for it, an optical motion capture system like Vicon or OptiTrack is going to give you the best quality. Now, this stuff isn't cheap, but it's getting cheap enough that more and more studios are seeing the value in having their own systems, not having to plan and book and often travel to shoot with an external vendor. The second mocap misunderstanding, thinking that you can just mocap a bunch of stuff and untangle it later. Not planning your shoot can make the biggest difference between being able to afford mocap and not. I could have segued straight into this from the pre-production bit because planning or not planning your mocap shoot is one of the clearest places to see the effect of good planning on your budget. You can do a lot in one day on a mocap stage, but if you haven't spent the weeks leading up to shoot preparation, that one day of shooting can easily turn into several days and several times the cost. Especially if you're going to an external mocap house, not planning your shoot is a great way to just throw away money. How to plan a mocap shoot, I'm afraid, is now outside the scope of this revised talk, but I will try my best to summarize the 20-plus slides that I cut here. Get ready for the speed round. Organize your data, what you're gonna shoot, what you're gonna call it, where you're gonna put it. Know this before you shoot. There's a lot of great talks out there on the topic. One of my favorites is from my friend Simon Unger. Next thing, make sure your character skeleton isn't gonna explode when mocap data is applied. No rotations, no scaling, single axis of translation. This was a tip from Simon K at Double Negative. It's not even something that I thought about too much because I always had tech artists making my rigs, but it's a good tip. Casting. This is one of the major misunderstandings that people have about mocap. The first rule of casting is to remember that acting is a profession and one that people make a lot of money at for being good at. And the better your mocap data is, the more of the actor's performance is going to come through. Remember these guys? Hire professionals. I can't emphasize this enough. Mocap is the foundation of your animation performance, and you'll want it to be as strong as you can. Try to cast an actor that matches the body type, personality, and skill set of your characters. And be involved in the casting. Some stages might want to use their own talent. Make sure you know who you're going to get before you pay for it. Having an airtight shot list is crucial, especially if you're shooting at a house. And if you're shooting cinematics, keep in mind that rewrites are way cheaper than reshoots. Especially if you're on a tight budget, plan to go to the stage with the final script. One more case for in-house mocap, by the way. Know what the environment is going to be. Layout, dimensions, etc., anything that the talent will need to navigate or interact with. And make sure it's not going to get shuffled around later by your level designers. Knowing the set is important, and so is the prop list, especially if you have anything specialized. You might not always be able to get the correct prop, but maybe you can find or mock up something close. Think about what the key points of interaction are. The less action you have to change, the less time and money you spend correcting the intention. Lastly, for gameplay shoots, there's a lot of numbers that you're going to want to know before you go into the shoot. What's your run speed, your sprint speed, your crouch and crawl speed? What are the heights of your cover objects? These need to be locked down too. Hopefully in the early bit about scale and timing, you realize why we want to capture the talent moving at the correct speeds, or at least as much as possible. Bonus level would be if you actually calculate the height difference between your in-game character and the talent, and then have them move at speeds that will be the correct, appropriate speed for when applied to the taller or shorter skeleton. Directing. Make sure the actor knows their motivation, who, what, where, why. The more info you give them, the better a job that they'll do. Directing actors is a whole skill set, but is a process better documented than most aspects of game development since it's been happening for a lot longer. Don't underestimate the importance of direction. Cleanup is on this list because you should absolutely be planning your shoots with the knowledge that you're not going to just throw it in the game and it's going to work. Not saying it's never happened, but don't plan on it. And I'll elaborate in my third misconception about motion capture. That once you have it, you don't need animators. You'll hopefully need less animators for less time than keyframing it all from scratch would be, but a lot of that is dependent on how well you pulled off the last step of immaculately planning your shoot. Fixing mocap is more than just cleaning it, and that requires the eye of an animator. Remapping a 1.5 meter person's mocap to a 2 meter tall person's skeleton is going to change a lot about the performance, from how fast they travel with each step to how far they have to reach to grab something. And that's assuming the difference in their scale is uniform, which it's pretty much guaranteed not to be. And that's another thing you'll have to fix. You have to consider that if one of your actors is 1.5 meter tall and they play a character that's 2 meters tall and the script requires them to waltz with a character who is 1.6 meters tall but played by an actor who is 1.3 meters tall, someone's going to have to fix that. Difference in gameplay animation requirements is a big one. Hopefully you at least capture for the correct speed and cover heights, at least to the best of yours and your actor's ability. But games have a tendency to push the limits of what's physically possible, so someone might need to make that 1 meter jump into a 3 meter jump. And if it's a player character, you're probably going to want to shave off all those frames of anticipation so it feels responsive. Difference in readability. Remember, we don't want realism, we want believability. And sometimes that means our real actions don't look as good as they could once implemented. Christian Janjuk has talked about this a lot in his work on Splinter Cell Blacklist. A skilled animator can take mocap and push the poses and trim out the fat to get a quicker, sharper, more satisfying performance without breaking the realistic style that it's based on. Motion capture, especially good motion capture, is a huge head start on animation, but with a good animator, you can take it a lot further. Lastly, it's entirely possible that you're going to have to repurpose some mocap from one use to another, and that can still be big time savings over a new shoot or new animation. But it's it's not exactly what you need. If it's not exactly what you need, an animator is going to have to correct that. Anyway, that's a lot in mocap even after editing. Here are some smart, experienced mocap people to follow who contributed to compiling this information. There's more for sure, but these are people who go deep into it. A reminder, as I talk about planning this stuff, a lot of these are idealistic. You're going to mess some of them up. I'm going to go back to my job next week and I'm going to mess some of them up. But I promise more stuff is going to go wrong if we don't at least try. The second part I'd originally wanted to dive much deeper into, as we hopefully all know, the internet is rife with misinformation about games and how they're made or what a career in them looks like. I have some fear that students and other game devs of tomorrow are going to read this garbage and get the wrong idea. I've been compiling a list of the top things that people misunderstand about game dev. I was going to address misconceptions like reusing animations or how easy it is to do this or that. I wanted to address them one by one, but every few days there's a new one. The misinformation is relentless. Social media and ad revenue incentivizes people to turn out garbage information for clicks and outrage. People who are actually making games are too busy to be posting YouTube videos every day. Our income stream is selling games. Theirs is getting clicks. Whatever makes game developers look lazy and greedy becomes today's spontaneous conspiracy theory. I could do a whole hour on stupid ideas that people have about how the industry works, but we wouldn't really be any wiser for it in the end. So this is the part that I cut most aggressively. So I don't know that there's much to talk about in this section other than to tell the students in this room that most of what they hear online about game dev is total nonsense to get clicks from angry gamers. Don't let it dissuade you from a career in games. There's actually a number of vocal and experienced developers who are quite open about how the industry works and are generally happy to answer questions. This isn't a list to reference, it's just random people I follow on Twitter, most of whom are professional artists, animators, or devs. There's a huge advantage to conferences like this over just trawling YouTube for answers. Here you're hearing from and talking to people face-to-face who've actually made games before and not some random and completely unaccountable source of information. You're at a conference with a number of professional developers eager to answer your questions. Ask them. There's some pretty smart people in town for Konsoll, and I'm here too. Take advantage. I will say that the quality of coverage of how games work is a lot better than it used to be if you're looking in the right places. Extra Credits YouTube channel and no-clip documentaries tend to be pretty spot on, so that's one place to start. GameDev.world is like a free online GDC. So I'll sum it up with this. Recognize that the experts aren't always the ones who talk the loudest, and they're rarely the ones with the biggest social media following. YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter have a lot more noise than signal, but you can find that if you dig, you can find people to trust. Students especially, be very skeptical of anyone who claims to know how games are made without having made a game. That's kind of a segue into my third and final section. I'm a little tighter on time than I thought I was, so I'm going to start talking a little bit faster. Apologies. My last section is on career misunderstandings, what a career in games looks like in the long run. This part's going to be a little more personal. Everyone's career is a personal thing. It's a result of the work they do and the decisions that they make. Like the last topics, I'll just plow through the list a bit. Can you have a long career in game development? I guess this is a thing that people out there still think. I hear it from outside the industry how horrible we have it because they keep listening to fake experts. But these are the numbers from last year. 90% of game developers are likely or very likely to stay in game dev in the next 5 years. Those are great numbers. A lot of industries are going to change a lot more than that over the next 5 years. So I'm not really sure how to answer that, except, yeah, it's totally possible. I also hear a lot of people say it's a young industry, and that's definitely true of some studios. But a lot of the perception is dated because the industry itself is young. As it ages, so do the people who were there early on. The last 3 studios I've worked at, the average age has definitely been on the high side of 30 and pretty close to 40. So yeah, it's sustainable as long as you pace yourself, and I'll talk more about that shortly. Speaking of surviving years in the industry, what happens if you do? Maybe you start thinking about job titles and promotions. I was talking to a friend about my transition from senior to lead to director. Most of it had to do with the knowledge that I had an expertise that was underutilized and that I could affect change on a higher level in a position of leadership. Some of it had to do with an increasing misalignment of my job title and my actual responsibilities. When you're functionally the lead, but you have senior level content responsibilities, you can wind up working 2 jobs to get it all done with nearly 2 jobs worth of hours. But I'll admit there was also part of me that was scared. I felt like the clock was ticking. I was right around 40 years old and I thought, how many years am I going to be viable to promote to an animation director? I don't know if the industry is that ageist or if I'm just afraid of my own mortality. But I felt like this was something I needed to prove sooner rather than later. I had a good body of experience, but I also still had a lot of fire in me. Did I want to be a 60-year-old senior animator? There's a lot wrong with this line of thinking. One, it's super ageist. It denigrates the importance of content creators over leadership. It kind of highlights the deficiencies of job titles. And lastly, it's ignorant, well, for a lot of reasons, and I'll touch base on those. Let's start with the job titles, because I think this is a thing that I'm in the middle of dealing with as I try to build out the animation team at the initiative. This is my 18-year career in titles. I've always had some leadership ambitions, but I also like working on big ships, which has sometimes meant that I would bump into the ceiling for a little while. But if this resume came across a recruiter's desk, what would it say? If you're being positive, you could say that person is probably a really good animator, or that person just likes animating, which is great. This resume is totally fine. But if you're being less positive, especially if you didn't have all the information, you could say, why weren't they more ambitious? Not everyone wants to be a lead. Not everyone should be a lead, and numerically speaking, we can't all be leads. But what if all I did was animate guns on Battlefield for 10 years? What would be my value to this industry besides animating guns, either for DICE or some other place that makes games with guns in it? I wouldn't be an animator so much as a super specialized widget maker at that point, and the industry will turn you into one of those if you let it. I saw a friend at GDC 2018 and he said, "Oh, you're still doing guns? Aren't you afraid of being pigeonholed?" Hell yes, I was afraid of being pigeonholed. I knew I wasn't sticking around DICE by then, but that it had gotten that far was kind of a slap in the face. The real problem here is that after the promotion I got 5 years into this industry by leaving Treyarch for a shitty studio for a small pay bump but a better title, is that we don't have more career stepping stones than just associate animator, animator, senior animator, and anything after that is just a totally different job. That's true of any discipline, programmer, designer, writer, whatever. You maybe start as a junior or associate up in the tributary, you keep on down the river to staff, and then you drift out to the sea of seniority. Then you're on your own for the rest of your working life. No wonder so many people aspire to be leads. If you're used to looking at your career as a ladder, then there's nowhere else to go. Especially in something like animation, when I post a job ad for senior animator, I get people with 5 to 35 years of experience. It leaves me, as someone who's hiring, longing for more fidelity in job titles, and for people working, it gives them more landmarks in their career than a void that pushes them towards leadership and away from their craft. I think it would be better to have a more consistent ladder than what we have now with more steps, and that's kind of a problem for the industry to solve. My gripe about titles is with the industry for not getting more specific or unified with them. But where I hope the valuable part is for you is to see that titles are a carrot, and what's most important is that you're happy with the work you do on a day-to-day basis. A job title isn't going to change that. Your goal here should be to keep yourself satisfied in your work, knowledgeable in your field, and compensated fairly for it. Don't lose sight of your day-to-day happiness for the carrot. Another point about career advancement is how do you stay valuable as you get older? How do you become more valuable? I don't just mean financially, though that is part of it. How do you sustain your career by being someone that people hire? You're eventually going to be more expensive than the young folks, and you might be slower. This is where you need to double down on being wiser. It gets back to that conversation with my friend about being a 60-year-old animator. He works in film and told me about the folks who are the experts, masters of their craft, who can pick and choose the projects and command handsome sums of money because nobody else is that good. That's not something I've had much exposure to in the business of games. We just don't have a lot of those people, but it makes sense. Like if Brad Bird or Glenn Keane wants to just animate on your project and their rate was 10 times what a junior costs, you'd be stupid to not at least think about it. Those folks are masters of a craft. They don't get stuck on petty crap like Maya versus Blender or ZBrush versus, I guess it's just ZBrush now. Mastering a craft is learning animation so well that you don't have to care about the software because you know what looks good. You know how to make things move in appealing ways. Maybe it's learning to design a game so well that you know how to tune and balance a board game to be just as compelling as something on Unreal Blueprints. Mastering a craft is learning sculpture and anatomy so well that it doesn't matter if you're making it in ZBrush or clay. Mastering a craft is something that no new version of a software, layoff, acquisition, or closure can ever take away from you. Given a time machine, could Michelangelo have made it as a professional 3D artist? Yeah, I'm going to say yes, though he'd probably be insufferable to work with. But when you learn to sculpt first, the medium starts to matter less. I said earlier, the industry will pigeonhole you if you let it. We can find good and even fun work that keeps us going in the short term but stifles our long-term growth. Make sure you're learning a craft and not just how to pull certain levers or make a widget. That means you're going to have to keep learning. You've got to keep creating. This is where you might not be able to rely on your job to fully scratch your itches. People live and breathe this stuff. You're competing for jobs with some of those people. So how do you juggle all that? Learning new skills at work, new skills in your free time? Who has time for all that? Well, I'd love to squeeze in a little bit here at the end that tells you about how to balance everything, but it's a complicated question. I mentioned bad career advice before, and as as advice specific to a career in games, I hear things like never crunch, never do free work, never underbid. And I'm not saying those are things that you should do, but you might find that a lot of successful people have done those things in the past, especially crunch. On the other hand, if you're any good and willing to kill yourself for your work, somebody's going to pay you for that. Creative people tend to be very exploitable, and it's been happening throughout human history. There's no clear answer here. And who am I to talk about work-life balance when the fact that I'm here in Norway this year, giving the talk in the middle of major life upheaval, is a testament to my tendency to overcommit. I used to joke, if you're not biting off more than you can chew, you're not using your whole mouth. But that was cuter when I used to get a good night's sleep. So as my talk comes to a close, I'm going to regurgitate someone smarter than me one more time, and it's been a good way for me to think about this topic. It's one of those inspirational memes that goes around sometimes. It gets rewritten and edited to match whatever agenda of whoever is sharing it, but the core message of it's good. It was part of a longer commencement speech at Georgia Tech in 1991 by Brian Dyson, who was the CEO of Coca-Cola at the time, about the 3 secret ingredients to success. According to him, they are vision, confidence, and luck, which I think is fairly accurate, but that's not the relevant part here. The part that gets most often quoted is near the end of the speech, and so, since this is near the end of my speech, maybe it will help me end with CEO like gravitas. Imagine life as a game in which you're juggling some 5 balls in the air. You name them: work, family, health, friends, and spirit. And you're keeping it all in the air. You will soon understand that work is a rubber ball. If you drop it, it will bounce back. But the other 4 balls, family, health, friends, and spirit, are made of glass. If you drop one of these, they will be irrevocably scuffed, marked, nicked, damaged, or even shattered. They will never be the same. You must understand that and strive for balance in your life." Unquote. I mentioned that because I mentioned before that I changed jobs twice in the last 12 months. That's why I moved twice, and that's how I got promoted. In the process, I dropped more than one of those balls, one of the glass ones. It's been almost 6 months. I'm still not quite over it. It's complicated and it's personal like any of these things, and it's nobody's fault but my own. Did I have to drop a ball to advance my career? Of course not. I navigated it poorly and lost sight of the big picture. The only secret to dealing with it that I know is to know that you're going to spend the rest of your life juggling. I think that that's probably true of every career and life in general, but maybe even more so in a passion-driven industry like this. You saw the numbers. People like working in games. People have hobbies, relationships, spouses, lives, families, kids. You don't have to kill yourself to succeed in this industry, but don't misunderstand that you're probably never going to have to stop juggling. That's what I have to share. This went over a lot longer than I thought it would, but I guess we have a little bit of time for questions. That's it. Thank you. I guess the microphone will get priority, but if anybody has anything here, otherwise I can just check the Twitter questions real quick. That would be from... All right.
I want to thank you. This was really, really cool. I'm 43 years old. I have 2 kids. I'm married. I do games since over 20 years. And it is inspirational to see someone being so honest about that, because it's still a kind of difficult topic to talk about. And when everybody is like, don't crunch, it's like, yeah. We not really openly talk about it, because we get, especially what you said about what's going on with social media and with media and clicks. Mm-hmm. You see so many articles right now that are like wanting us to burn for things we did, where I think, what is this? This is not your problem, actually.
Right.
You're talking about something you really don't understand. So this, to having someone like you standing there and talking about this balance between passion and I never heard about this juggling with a glass ball. That's a really good one. I like that. So I have no question. I just want to say this is really cool, and I think it's really it means something to stand there and say that in public.
Cool.
So really cool. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for saying so.
Hi Ryan.
Hi.
I was at your talk in, was it 2017?
Yes, it was.
I wanted to say that may sound weird, but I really enjoyed this talk over your past talk.
Less car analogies.
And,
fair.
and that's my kind of leads up to my question, because what I've noticed in my time as a student is that I kind of don't appreciate animation. It's probably weird, and I think you're probably a person who's really passionate about animation. So I just wanted to like kind of hear, do you think animation is a luxury or a necessity? If it makes sense.
The short answer would be a luxury, in that it is not a necessity. Like if you're going to make a game, you can make it without animation. You can't make a game without code. You can make it without a game designer. It might not be fun. You can make it without art. It might not look good. And you can make it without animation, and it might not move good. So on the high level, it's a luxury. If you choose to ignore it, especially in this competitive market, well, I don't know. You need to stand out on something. And so making ugly, badly moving games, I don't think is as acceptable as it used to be. Molly and Eric had talked about Thomas Was Alone, and that's a fantastic one. You could look at that and be like, oh, that has bad art. But it doesn't have bad art. It actually has art that serves the purpose of the game. And Mike Bithell did a ton of research into animation before making that game to make sure that these very simple primitives move with a lot of life and personality. He's pretty appreciative of animation after having made that game, and how much it added to it.
Yeah. Thank you.
We have any other questions? Do I have time to check any of the? Okay. I meant to get a moderator, but I didn't. So now you're gonna look at me watch Twitter. Sorry. Okay. How does it feel to work on a game like Anthem that was basically killed by investor or publisher pressure? Okay, well, I'm not moderating very well. The one thing I will say about that is that after that, and this is all public information, after that Kotaku article, which I'm not going to talk about Kotaku too much up here, but what I will say is when that went around, there was a lot of developers at very good studios who make 80, 90 Metacritic games, and BioWare is a very good studio, who are basically saying what happened in this article has described the experience of many, many games. I think a lot of these things get, I gotta be careful what I say here, but when the press wants to smear something, they will, oh man, I'm already saying stuff I shouldn't say, but that article wasn't describing an anomaly in game development. People have crunched on 50 Metacritic games or 90 Metacritic games. I think there's a lot of, hopefully some of the talks earlier, especially on the investor and publishing panel, might have cleared up some misconceptions about publisher-developer relationships. And I think people tend to see anything good about the game was the developer and anything bad about the game was the publisher. And that's a gross oversimplification of how that relationship works. So I wouldn't agree with that statement about what happened. Yeah, that's about, I probably already said too much, but yeah. Don't blame publishers every time there's something wrong with a game. Making games, hopefully, as everyone here can appreciate after whatever you've done in games and listening to the people talk here, making games is very hard, and it doesn't always go as well as we would hope.
Hi. I was just wondering if you could give some tips to the, especially I guess the students here, but you talked about talking to the experts. Maybe you have some more, how do you approach people? What's the best way to approach an expert with your questions, or maybe to ask somebody to like mentor you a little bit? I know that like there are people who might feel a little worried or afraid contacting people they look up to. Or like how what's a good approach?
I would say it's a good question. And there's a lot of ways I could answer it. I would say that the questions that are it's 50 minutes. That's why I ran out of time. The the best way to approach is with a targeted question. Like the more specific your focus, the better, the easier it is for me to answer. If you say, how do I get into games animation? Like, I don't know, Google it. Like it's out there. There are articles and videos and conferences and all this stuff that's accessible for free. So if you ask a question that is like, that's that broad, then it's hard for me not to dismiss it, because it's like, well, you're not gonna get into game animation, because if you just wanted it bad enough that you're gonna not look into it until you meet me, then like that's not gonna happen. So do as much, the more informed question that you have, the better. If somebody comes up to me at a conference and is like, how do I get into games animation? And somebody else comes up and they're like, tell me about the targeted IK additive animations that you use to correct the differences of holding different sized objects. Like one of those is a subject that's interesting for me, and that I can answer questions qualified on. The other one is like, I don't know what to tell you. That would, I think I mentioned it kind of related about like demo reel feedback is whenever I give people real feedback and I go real deep on it, I always preface it with like, hey, if I know I'm about to give you like 10 paragraphs of like what you did wrong, but you've given me enough information that I can be picking at it, that you get 10 paragraphs. If your demo reel is garbage, then you get a one sentence reply of like, I don't know, work on your principles a little bit more, work on stuff like that. So being focused in the way that you approach somebody and knowing maybe what you specifically can get from them. Like what kind of, if somebody comes up and asks me about a game I didn't work on, then what can I do? So targeted questions would be, I guess, the short answer.
Yeah. Thanks, and great talk, by the way.
Thank you. I'll prioritize the microphone over Twitter. I don't know how much.
Yeah, this is a question I also asked on Twitter, so
okay, cool.
Feel free to ignore it there.
Okay.
I'm a sound designer,
cool.
A game sound designer, and I find that there's often a bit of a miscommunication between sound designers and animators, where whenever a animator wants to change the animation quite a bit, it's seldom communicated to other places. So how can I, as a sound designer, keep up to date with changes in animation in a way that allows me to also update my sound? Thank you.
That's a great question. I think that is a matter of perspective, and where I mean perspective, because you're absolutely right. Animators are used to being almost at the end of the pipeline, and the only person after is audio. Well, and QA, but as far as asset pipeline on the high level, you're the only ones after us. So we're used to thinking ourselves as the end of the pipeline and not looking in a rearview mirror. And to continue car analogies, because you know how much I love those, I see audio as the car in the front of a 10-car pileup. And the animators are the car behind you, so you always get hit by the animators. We're getting hit by the rest of production, but it all looks like us when we crash into you. So when we're doing things like changing things and not telling you, that's never okay. No discipline interaction should ever be like that. So to the high level problem is that is something the animators are doing wrong. Like you need to communicate that stuff. There are what you can do if they're not listening. Hopefully I don't know what kind of team studio structure you have, but one thing that you can do, and a lot of software engineers will do this, is you can set up Perforce or probably whatever other source control you use to flag when certain people check in. So you can see when the animators have changed stuff. You can also flag certain assets, like your, whatever the assets that you're corresponding to. You shouldn't have to do that. You should impair, and hopefully you have the studio leadership support to say that, no, you need to tell people before you change it. Sometimes people can be locked out of Perforce at certain times. These are all very like fascist development techniques, so I don't recommend doing them as a first option. But like often on productions I've worked on, it's like we get to a point where Perforce is locked and then you need permission to check in. And audio is generally the exception to that because you're at the tail end and you're doing your work after beta half the time. So yeah, there's a number of techniques, but you are right. Animators should not treat you that way. I apologize for all animators. Yep. Anyone else? Are we out of time?
I think that's about it for today. So thank you, Ryan, for a fantastic talk. Big round of applause.
Thank you.